Now, that ideology didn't suddenly stop as soon as they confronted the experience of colonization in America. It was carried over. So there was a sense among the British aristocracy, who were now the governors of the crown colonies in British America, that if blacks were holding some individual whites in slavery or bondage, well, what the heck? These were, after all, poor whites, and this was their natural state. To the credit, I certainly don't wish to indict all wealthy whites. I'm not engaged in the class warfare here. I come from a family that had a fairly affluent background, so I don't have any axe to grind. It's just that this is what the facts, the documentary record, the empirical facts speak, and I must therefore be the vessel of their articulation. But there was finally a law passed. If you look at Henning's history of the statutes of Virginia, they actually had to pass a law saying that no black or Indian shall hold a Christian in bondage. Well, Christian was a euphemism for white person. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that we know. Because, you know, they came to be very ashamed and embarrassed. The record of white enslavement is not something that they wanted to broadcast to the world. It was something that existed in a kind of an anomalous and ambiguous fashion, and one has to hunt these things out. Now, I'm not saying that it's something that was in code. But if we see a law that says no Indian or black shall hold Christians in bondage, we have to understand that these were people who were very reluctant to pass a great deal of laws. The people at that time felt, those who were religiously inclined, felt that the Ten Commandments were plenty of laws. If they passed a law, you can be sure that it was because there was a need for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is this not being known more widely in America? Why is this being swept under the rug?
I think that to a certain degree, Ernst, there is a function here of consensus reality that tends to prevail in human beings. I do not have a high opinion of human nature. And I think that humanity, more often than not, has a sheep-like, cow-like, bovine nature to itself. And since the received opinion is that blacks were slaves and whites were always the wealthy overseers, people don't tend to rock the boat. Now, people whose profession it is to look into this matter, university historians and academicians whose job it is to investigate and sift history, have this function of political correctness, which impinges on their tenure, their salaries, and indeed their relationship to the community. So if they begin to explore a politically incorrect area, then of course they may be subject to sanction. Secondly, we have a gigantic industry in the United States and in the West which is determined to limit black people to a slave mentality, to tell them you've been slaves, and the only way you're ever going to get out of that is to rely on the slave mentality of the socialistic welfare democratic system, which is going to subsidize your manumission ever further. Well, as we know, no one ever gets out of his own bondage by someone else doing it for you. It's by your own work that you bring yourself out of bondage. Because certainly white slaves were the ones who freed themselves by their own unruliness and their own rebelliousness. Unfortunately, in the chronicle of black history, we do have to adduce the fact that the Nat Turner Rebellion was one of the few great black rebellions in the South, along with Toussaint L'Ouverture in Haiti. There were very few. But there is this mentality to impose this, and of course then we have the Martin Luther King industry, the civil rights industry. So that represents a phenomenal weight, a huge weight pressing down on people. I do think, though, that my book, in its own subtle kind of guerrilla way, I say subtle because only 5,000 copies have been sold. We're sort of a samizdat press ourselves. I do think that it's beginning to percolate down into the halls of academy.
Is there not a good message here that one can say to blacks and to whites, look, you're not on opposite ends of a spectrum. You actually have a common shared experience, because undoubtedly many of the working class whites, the descendants of working class whites in America, are therefore descendants of white slavery as the blacks were of black slavery.
Absolutely, and especially in Appalachia, where you had the phenomenon of the so-called border southern whites, the whites who peopled West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. People like Andrew Johnson, who became a president of the United States. He was vice president under Lincoln. Andrew Johnson had been an indentured servant. He was an apprentice tailor. He was treated brutally. He ran away. I don't consider him a white slave in the technical sense, because by that period in America's history, it had moved into, as a mass phenomenon, into something that was more a temporary bondage. However, nevertheless, you did have the fact that a reward was posted for him. For a president of the United States as a young man, a reward was posted, a wanted poster was issued, and he had to flee the state of Tennessee. He went on to become vice president, and after Lincoln was assassinated, president of the United States. But there was an independent group of Americans living in those mountain border regions who were unwilling to fight for the Confederacy, not because they were scalawags who sided with the blacks, but because in a sense they were ultra-nationalistic whites who didn't want to lift a finger for the planter aristocracy in the South, who poor white people felt treated blacks better than they did poor whites. So yes, there is a unity and a common heritage not only between blacks and whites, but between all people on this earth in the sense of servitude. I certainly don't believe in a new world order or one big world, but I'm talking about in terms of this experience. And out of that we can understand that there has been a terrible distortion of history and really an indictment of our historians for allowing this absurdity to hold forth, that there has been one race that has been enslaved more than the others. That may be the modern sense since 1840. It is certainly not the sense of the entire corpus of world history. In fact, the opposite has held true. Whites have been enslaved to the same extent or more than blacks.
Mike Hoffman, a very interesting topic, a very unusual topic, and undoubtedly not very much discussed by the media that is basically bringing only politically correct subjects. I hope that people at colleges and so on will invite you, and I hope that people who see the program will go and get in touch with you. A very interesting, fascinating, sad, interesting topic. Ernst Swindle here for another Voice of Freedom.